I never expected a photograph to change the way I remembered my own life. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. There was nothing unusual about that day. I woke up a little earlier than usual, made myself a cup of coffee, opened the curtains, and watched the quiet street outside my window. The weather was mild, the sky was pale blue, and everything around me felt completely familiar. I had lived in that house for almost 6 years. I knew every crack in the pavement outside, every tree along the sidewalk, and even the times when the neighbors usually left for work. My life was simple. I worked from home, kept to myself, and spent most evenings reading or taking long walks around the neighborhood. I had never been particularly interested in mysteries or strange coincidences. I liked things that made sense. That morning, however, something appeared in my mailbox that made absolutely no sense. I noticed it when I went outside to collect the mail. There were 2 envelopes, a grocery advertisement, and one small photograph. The photograph had no envelope. It was simply lying between the letters. At first, I assumed it had been delivered to the wrong address. I picked it up, expecting to find a name or an address written on the back. There was nothing. The photograph itself was old. The edges were slightly yellowed, and one corner had been bent at some point. It showed a small house surrounded by trees. I looked at it for several seconds before I realized why it felt familiar. The house in the photograph looked exactly like the house I lived in. Not similar, exactly the same. The windows were in the same places. The small porch was there. Even the large tree beside the front steps appeared to be the same. But there was one obvious difference. The photograph showed the house many years earlier. The paint was different. The garden looked younger. The trees were smaller. I turned the photograph over again. Nothing. No date. No name. No explanation. I brought it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For the next hour, I tried to convince myself that it was simply an old photograph of the property. Perhaps someone had lived there before me and accidentally put it in my mailbox. That explanation seemed reasonable until I looked at the photograph. Again, there was a person standing near the edge of the garden. A little girl. She was too far away to see her face clearly, but something about her posture caught my attention. She was standing beside the large tree, the same tree that still stood beside my house. I felt an uncomfortable sensation in my stomach. I had never seen that photograph before, yet I couldn't stop looking at it. I carried it upstairs and compared it with an old photograph of my house that I had taken shortly after moving in. The tree was there. The porch was there. The windows were there. Everything matched. I spent most of that afternoon searching through old property records online. The house had been built decades before I moved in. Several families had lived there, but nothing about the photograph appeared in the records I could find. I eventually gave up. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I was overthinking it. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. The little girl was holding something. It looked like a small white object. I enlarged the photograph on my computer and stared at it. It was a stuffed rabbit, a small white rabbit, with one dark ear. For some reason, that detail made me feel even more uneasy. I had owned a rabbit like that when I was a child, not just a similar one, the same kind. At least that was what I remembered. I had kept it for years. It had been one of the few toys I refused to throw away. But when I was around 11 years old, it disappeared. I had searched everywhere for it. I remembered being heartbroken. After all these years, I had completely forgotten about it until I saw the photograph. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I checked the mailbox before doing anything else. There was another photograph. This one showed a park. I recognized it immediately. It was the park where I had spent most of my childhood summers. The photograph showed an old wooden bench beneath a large tree. I stared at it for a long time. Then I noticed a small girl sitting on the bench. Her face was turned away from the camera. Beside her was the same white rabbit. I felt a chill move through me. This could no longer be explained as a photograph of my house that had accidentally been delivered to me. Someone knew something about my childhood. Someone had photographs of places I remembered, and somehow, those photographs were appearing in my mailbox. I turned the second photograph over. This time, there was something written on the back, only 4 words. You forgot what happened there. I read those words again and again. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, for the first time in many years. I began trying to remember something I had spent most of my life avoiding. The summer when my white rabbit disappeared, and the summer when I stopped visiting that park. I had always believed I simply grew up, but as I sat there with the photograph in my hands, I began to wonder whether that was really what happened, because somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath years of ordinary memories, there was another memory trying to surface. A memory I had never understood. A memory of that park. A memory of a little girl. And a memory of something happening beneath the old tree. I just couldn't remember what it was. The more I tried to remember that summer, the more confused I became. I knew I had spent a lot of time at the park when I was a child. I remembered the old wooden bench, the narrow path, and the large tree where my friends and I used to play. But there were gaps, strange gaps. I could remember certain moments clearly, yet everything around them seemed to disappear. I decided to visit the park. It was only a short drive from my house, and I thought seeing it again might help me recover whatever memory I had lost. When I arrived, the park looked smaller than I remembered. The wooden bench was still there. So was the tree. I stood beneath its branches for several minutes, trying to remember. Nothing happened at first. Then I noticed something carved into the tree, a small heart. Inside it were two initials, my initials, and another letter. I couldn't understand why they were there. I had no memory of carving them. I touched the old marks with my fingers, and suddenly I remembered something. Not everything, just a fragment. I was sitting beneath the tree. I was holding my white rabbit, and another little girl was sitting beside me. I remembered her hair. I remembered the blue ribbon she wore, but I couldn't remember her name. That frightened me more than anything else. I had always believed I had a normal childhood. I had never thought there was anyone important I had somehow forgotten. I returned home that evening feeling unsettled. The next morning, there was another photograph waiting in my mailbox. This one was different. It showed two little girls standing in front of the house where I now lived. I immediately recognized myself. I was holding the white rabbit. The other girl was standing beside me. She was wearing the blue ribbon. I turned the photograph over. There was another message. You promised you wouldn't forget me. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I began searching through old family photographs my parents had kept, several boxes in storage, and I spent almost the entire afternoon going through them. Most of the photographs showed ordinary moments, birthdays, school events, family vacations, Christmas mornings. Then I found one photograph that made my hands stop moving. It showed me as a child, standing beside the same girl from the photographs. On the back, my mother had written a date. I recognized the year immediately. It was the year I had always remembered as the beginning of a new school, but there was something else written underneath. A name, Anna. The moment I read it, something inside me shifted. Anna, I suddenly remembered her. She had lived in the house next to mine. She had been my closest friend. We spent almost every afternoon together during that summer. The memories began returning in pieces. We built little houses beneath the tree. We shared snacks. We rode our bicycles around the neighborhood. And we had made a secret promise. We had promised that when we grew up, we would always find each other again. Then came the memory I had been trying to reach. The day Anna disappeared from my life. It had been raining. We had gone to the park. I remembered carrying the white rabbit. I remembered Anna running toward the old bridge. Then I remembered hearing a loud sound. After that, everything became unclear. I had always believed Anna had simply moved away, but the photographs were telling me something different. I searched for her name online. At first, I found nothing. Then I discovered an old local newspaper archive. There was an article from that summer. A young girl had been injured near the park after falling from an old wooden bridge. Her name was Anna. I stared at the screen. The article explained that Anna had survived, but her family had moved away shortly afterward. I felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. She had survived, but why had I forgotten her? And who was sending me the photographs? The next photograph answered Part of that question.it showed Anna as an adult. She was standing in front of a small house I recognized. The place immediately.it was the house where I now lived. On the back was a short message. She came back. I couldn't sleep that night. The following morning, there was no photograph in my mailbox. Instead, there was a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten address. I recognized the street.it was only 20 minutes away. I drove there that afternoon. The house was modest, with a small garden and a blue door. For several minutes, I simply sat in my car. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Eventually, I walked to the front door. Before I could knock, I noticed something beside the entrance, a small white rabbit, not the old toy, a new one, but it looked almost exactly the same. I stood there, staring at it, and then I understood. The photographs weren't meant to frighten me, they were meant to make me remember. I turned around and looked at the house one last time, for the first time in decades. I remembered Anna's face clearly, and I realized there was still one part of that summer I had completely forgotten. The promise we had made beneath the tree, because I suddenly remembered that Anna hadn't been the one who disappeared. I had, and someone had spent years waiting for me to remember why. I stayed in my car for several minutes before I finally understood what I had remembered. The promise beneath the tree had not been about finding each other when we grew up. It had been about something much simpler. We had promised to return to the park on the same day every year. No matter where we lived. No matter how old we became, we would meet beneath the old tree and bring the white rabbit with us. It had sounded important when we were children, but children make promises all the time. I had forgotten mine. Anna hadn't. I finally knocked on the blue door. A few moments later, it opened. I saw her face and immediately knew it was her. She had changed, of course. We were no longer children, but there was something familiar in her eyes that made the years between us disappear for a moment. I didn't need an explanation. The photographs had already told me most of the story. Anna had returned to our neighborhood years earlier. She had discovered that my family had moved away and eventually learned that I had bought the old house where she and I had spent so much time together. She had been there before I moved in. She had seen the house restored. She had seen the tree, and she had remembered everything. She had also kept something else, the original white rabbit. I had believed it was lost forever. But after the accident near the bridge, Anna had found it beneath the tree. She had kept it all those years. That was why she had started sending the photographs. She didn't want to frighten me. She wanted me to remember a part of my childhood that had disappeared from my memory after the accident. The accident itself had been less dramatic than I had imagined. I hadn't fallen from the bridge, and I had been the one who ran for help. The shock had affected me more deeply than anyone realized. And over the following weeks, my memories of that summer had become confused. My parents eventually moved away. I started a new school. Life continued, and somehow, Anna became a forgotten chapter, until the photographs. Before I left that afternoon, Anna gave me the old white rabbit. It was worn and faded, but I recognized it immediately. I held it in my hands and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not fear, something closer to gratitude. I finally understood why she had chosen photographs instead of simply contacting me. She knew that a message from a stranger would have made me suspicious, but a photograph could awaken something that words couldn't. She had wanted me to discover the memory myself. A few days later, I returned to the park. I brought the rabbit with me. The old tree was still standing. The wooden bench was still there. I sat beneath the branches and looked at the place where Anna and I had once spent so many afternoons. For the first time, the memories felt complete. I remembered the laughter, the games, the rainy afternoon, the ambulance, my parents taking me away, and the promise. I had forgotten the promise for most of my adult life, but forgetting something doesn't always mean it wasn't important. Sometimes memories disappear because they are too painful. Sometimes they disappear because life becomes busy, and sometimes they simply wait. They wait for the right photograph, the right place, the right person, or the right moment. A week later, another photograph appeared in my mailbox. This time, it was different. It wasn't old. It had been taken recently. It showed the tree in the park. Beneath it were two small objects, the white rabbit and a second photograph. I turned it over. There was only one sentence: some promises are worth remembering. I smiled when I read it. Then I placed the photograph in a frame. I kept it beside the old picture of the two little girls. After that, Anna and I slowly became part of each other's lives. Again, we didn't try to recreate our childhood. We didn't pretend the years between us hadn't happened. We simply accepted that life had taken us in different directions and somehow brought us back to the same place. The strangest part was that I no longer thought of the photographs as mysterious. They had started as something that frightened me. Then, they became clues, and finally, they became reminders. They reminded me that my past wasn't something I needed to run from. It was part of who I had become. Sometimes I still look at that first photograph, the old house, the young trees, the little girl standing beside the garden, and the white rabbit in her hands. For years, I thought the photograph showed a life I had forgotten. Now I understand that it showed something else. It showed a friendship that had survived even when my memory hadn't, and every time I look at it, I remember something my younger self once knew very well. Some people can disappear from your life without ever truly disappearing from your story. Sometimes all it takes is one photograph to bring them back.